So our mission is to create, protect, and preserve wildlife habitat through education, like tonight, engagement, and enjoyment. And actually, we hope that all those things happen. So one of the things that we really promote is supporting wildlife, and you do that with, they need the same things we do. They need things to eat, they need water, they need a place to get out of the weather and to hide from predators, and they need places to raise their families. These can, you can add these elements to your yard, either the natural elements as trees, bushes, if you have a creek or a pond, all the better. Or you can add feeders or bird baths, bird houses, so all those sort of things. Those are all, you know, easy to get, easy to have. And actually our raffle prize tonight, so everybody stick around when this is over, because we do have a raffle after every program, and it's a hummingbird, because it is, I mean, the hummingbirds are here, so it's time to get those feeders out. So I hope everybody got a raffle ticket. If you didn't, we'll make sure you have one by the end. Couple of things you can do when you support wildlife, when you add these things, you can register your yard on the Butterfly Highway, which is a program of the North Carolina Wildlife Federation. So putting pollinator plants in your yard, it can be in pots on a balcony, it can be happening, and it doesn't matter the size, it's your plant selection. So make sure, you know, when you're planting things to, you know, to look up, is this native to North America, is it native to the Southeast region? And then you'll have good success with those plants too. You can also certify it with the National Wildlife Federation. A lot of you, how many of y'all have already done that? All right, great, so that's cool. And again, that can be as small as a balcony, as large as whatever. So, and all you need are these elements, and information in the back if you're interested, if you want to pick that up, that you can go through. It's like a checklist, so it helps you know what you might have. I want to thank our volunteers. In March, we had a lot of fun. So we did a creek cleanup at Chantilly Ecological Sanctuary on Briar Creek. We got 400 pounds of trash that day, including an office chair. Yeah, so you just never know what you're gonna find. And then we, the following week, we did an invasives removal at the Charlotte Museum of History. There are some people that really enjoy doing that, because you get to cut things down, pull things out. And so we removed a whole bunch of ligustrum and English ivy, and what was the other thing? Honeysuckle. And we put in about 30 plants, which included a high bush blueberry, spice bush, some river cane. So those are all native species that went along. There's actually a nature trail at the Charlotte Museum of History. There's gonna be some signage out there to kind of help people know where it is. The other thing is the Charlotte Earth Day Festival is being held on the grounds there. So, so this is an effort to kind of help get this, you know, a little more wildlife friendly. And I'm sure there will be ongoing projects. So just keep an eye on our website and our Facebook and Instagram, so that if you're available and you want to do this, you can sign up and help with that. We love volunteers, and it's fun. So events that we have upcoming this month. We are participating in the Carolina Raptor Center's Steam on the Wing and the Water Day. It's a free event. It's this coming Saturday. It's free, open to the public. They do this every year. They will have, we'll be there with an activity. There will be some other environmental groups there that they will have activities and exhibits. Admission to the, I think I said that, admission to the Raptor Center, to the Raptor Trail is free that day. So it's 10 to 3, come, if you know, bring family, bring friends. It's a lot of fun. Then the next thing I mentioned is the Charlotte Earth Day celebration. It's April 20th, and that's from 12 to 4 on that Saturday. And again, it'll be a lot of environmental groups, but there'll also be some entertainment there. And it's going to be a lot of fun. I think this used to be the one at First Ward. That wasn't available, so it's been moved there. So, and then the other event that we do need some volunteers for is the Catawba Road trash cleanup. So we partnered with keep Charlotte beautiful, and we've adopted a stretch on Tybola Road, and so we're obligated to 3 cleanups a year. This will be our 3rd one for this year, and we're going to do it on a Sunday morning. Since it's May, we wanted to try to do it before it's hot in the afternoon. So anyway, so that's 10 to 11:30. The sign up is on our website. In the next few days, it will be on our Facebook and probably Instagram. Maybe our Instagram person's going on vacation, so it may not get on until she gets back. But anyway, so if you want to come out and help get, I think you got what, 100 pounds, about 100 pounds last time along Catawba Road and some of the little side areas. So it's good to get rid of that because it is, you can see this little skunk with its head stuck in a yogurt cup. It is dangerous to wildlife. It's unsightly. The other thing that I'm really excited about is Rock in the Water. This is our annual fundraiser. It's paddling on Mount Island Lake, so it's kayaks and canoes. We have a number of kayaks and canoes that we're renting from Parks and Rec, and that are available for people to use. Or if you have your own kayak, canoe, stand-up paddleboard, you can bring that. It is $50 to register. We have all made a sign up out there. There's a QR code that goes to the registration page.
Paddle before you leave today. Kayak are going fast. There's only a few left.
We only have a few kayaks left. We've got all the canoes left.
Or you can bring your own boat or paddle.
But you can bring your own boat. That's right. Bring your own boat. So it's a lot of fun. We have Ryan Carter, who's the Catawba River Keeper. He's going to be leading our paddle and doing our nature talk. So we can paddle out to an osprey nest that's out on Mount Island Lake. We'll talk about the ospreys, the other wildlife that live there, talk about the, who's going to know that lake, like Catawba River Keeper? He's going to talk about that. Then we have lunch, and then we have a raffle with some really fun prizes. So it's a really fun day. If any of y'all done fall in the water, so you know that it's fun. So, and registration's back there. And our last program for this year is going to be our own Alden Card. He's going to be presenting about creating backyard houses.
And I'm currently creating I bought a house with my wife a year ago, and I'm in the process of creating my own backyard, side yard, front yard habitat. Yeah. So if you're interested in how to convert your property into wildlife habitat, let's talk about it together next month.
Or even if you already have one going, you're going to learn. I always learn new stuff. You're going to learn some new stuff from Alden. So so that'll be May 14th, and then we take a break in our programs through the summer. We'll start back up in September, and we're working on our topics. And speaking for that, if you guys have a topic you'd like for us to have a presenter on, or if you know a really great presenter, shoot us an email, because we're always open to ideas. We want to know what you guys want.
And if you're a great presenter, I said, if anyone here is
if anyone here would like to present something, we're open to that too. Okay, so what you're really here for is for our presentation tonight, Changes in the Land, with Nolan Dahm. So to read this. Nolan, he's a public historian and an educator who was born and raised in Des Moines, Iowa. He attended Wake Forest University, where he got his BA in history and politics and international affairs, and a master's degree in secondary education and teaching. Then he moved out west, where he had earned a master's degree in public history at Colorado State University. So he had experience there as a student teacher during COVID. That was fun, I'm sure. And also as a park ranger in Rocky Mountain National Park after the record-breaking wildfires that were out there, and that was an eye-opening introduction to professional work. That was a trial by fire, right? And so Nolan moved to Charlotte to be with his fiance, Rafi, and her family, and he's now the program and exhibits manager at the Charlotte Museum of History. And he feels lucky to work where he can use his training to tell about the wonderful city of Charlotte. Charlotte is rich in history, and we need to know about that. We need to keep that out in the open because everything's changing so much. He is a lifelong Iowa Hawkeye student. He was always from Iowa. So Nolan,
Please do that. We all know about Kate and Clark, right?
Yeah.
Gotta spread the gospel. She did lose, but
she was in the finals.
and she won our hearts.
Yes. Jane. Thank you for your patience.
Well, all right. Cool. Well, hi everybody. Cool turnout. I'm excited that we're all here. Like Donna was saying, I'm Nolan. I am the Programs and Exhibits Manager at the Charlotte Museum of History. That job is what it sounds like. But I've been there for about 2 years now. And yeah, I mean, it's been a really exciting time for us. The museum, we're a small staff of just 8 full-time people. Actually, sadly, 7 as of today, actually. But we are a really small staff here at the museum. And, you know, we're just really trying to steward a home site that I'll talk about in a second. But as Donna mentioned before I get started here, just a reminder, yeah, I mean, Earth Day, Charlotte Earth Day is being hosted at our site. It's been kind of a crazy ride getting this whole thing planned. It's the first time we're doing it at the museum. But yeah, I mean, we've been removing a bunch of invasive stuff, planting in native plants, and you know, the environmental sustainability part, but also for us, the historical accuracy is really important as well. So I'm excited to be here. I've attended a few of these talks virtually as well. So yeah, you know, this one's gonna be a little different probably than you're used to at these talks. Maybe a little bit less practical knowledge, frankly, and a little bit more history for y'all. So let me know if you have questions along the way, but we'll get started. So I titled my thing "Changes in the Land." Well, oh, I got left.
Yeah.
Okay, so I start with a big, huge quote because I'm a historian. We got to start with the quotes, right? But what I want to start here is, you'll see in the middle underlined here, for many Americans, wilderness is the last place where civilization has not fully infected the earth, right? I feel like for you all as wildlife stewards, that's probably a sort of value that you hold pretty dear to yourselves, is that there is something called wilderness that is worth stewarding, right? That's in the name of the Charlotte Wildlife Stewards. This is something that, you know, is really common in the environmental movement. He's referencing this Thoreau quote here: "In wilderness is the preservation of the world." Right? This, again, this idea that wilderness itself is something worth saving, right? But what I'm gonna do today is basically problematize all of that. I hope by the end here that we have a little bit different of an idea of what wilderness is, a little bit of an idea of, or maybe a little bit more specificity as we think about, what do we mean when we say nature? What do we mean when we say wildlife? What do we mean when we say a pristine natural environment, right? Those are questions that are all historically based. So, backing up a little bit, what do I do? What's a public historian? More quotes. So, the first here is a really awesome book that everybody reads in grad school. And what I want to emphasize that's different between public history and sort of regular history is that public history is a very much sort of public-oriented version of history, right? It's stewarding, it's making nature trails, right? It's actually interpreting stuff. It's working in museums, it's doing what I do on a daily basis. And what I've got underlined here is an important thing, which is that there's several versions of the past. There are several stories. There is no one history. As public historians, and what I do every single day in my job, I talk to folks like over here from the DAR, right? Who are more knowledgeable than I will ever be about certain parts of American history that occurred here in Mecklenburg County. So what we do is we don't just memorize stuff and tell it to you. We ask interesting questions and think about stuff from interesting angles. That's what historians do, or public historians, right? Another quote here. This is from a big, huge survey that was done in the 90s. It was actually a phone survey, which is kind of funny to think about now. But basically what they found is that everybody engages with the past. Everything has historical context. Everybody knows history, but not everybody necessarily thinks historically, right? Those are different things. And so what we do as public historians is we try to bridge that gap, help people ask questions that they might not have considered before about the past. So what does an environmental historian do? First of all, this is a quote I really love from a book called Spectres of the Atlantic. It's kind of a deep, really hard book to read, honestly, but it's really theoretical. But this quote here is really important to me, that time does not pass or progress, it accumulates. And I think you all as like wildlife stewards can really appreciate that the stuff that happened in the past 200 years ago is not gone, right? The fact, we'll talk about this in a second, trust me, we'll get into like actual history stuff here in a second, but like something to keep in mind here is that what happened here 200 years ago, a plantation that was plowed here 200 years ago, right? We still deal with the ramifications of that today. The wildlife stewards have been actively, right, trying to restore, whatever that means, we'll get to that in a second, but trying to restore a lot of these natural environments around Charlotte that have been devastated by plantations, right? That have been devastated by monocrop agriculture and urbanization and all of these problems that we know about. Another quote here, last one. This is also from The Trouble with Wilderness. And this is kind of that author's response to the idea of wilderness. He says that we should never imagine that we can flee into a mythical wilderness to escape history. In other words, no matter where you feel, no matter where you are, you cannot escape history. The most pristine natural environment that feels like it has never been touched by human hands, right? You're still not escaping history, right? This has all accumulated. And it's all still there, and we can still think about it, right? So with that said, let's get into sort of the environmental history of Charlotte, right? Why does all of this matter to what we do here in this room? So we start at the beginning. A reminder that the Catawba have always been here. And when I say always, I mean always, right? Their oral histories say that the Catawba people have been on this land since the beginning of human existence, right? And that's really important to remember because, again, when we talk about this place was wilderness, we have to remember that this place was never uninhabited. This place, the Catawba people were always here. The Catawba people were always stewarding this land. They were doing controlled burns in the forests, right? They were doing agriculture. They were growing corn, right? They were not just living in harmony with nature and balance as one, right? Sometimes we might have that myth in our head. But what the Catawba people were doing was managing an intense and complex natural and social and economic environment here in Charlotte. So what you see here is a map from the late 1600s. This is a copy of the map. So it was a white colonizer who made a copy of a map that was made by the Catawba people. And you'll see this is how the Catawba people conceptualize what this place looks like, right? This map doesn't really look like our map, but what you will notice on here, this is Charleston down here, this kind of squares. This square right here is Virginia. And then all of these circles are basically the trading networks that the Catawba had among their communities. All of these were similar language speaking communities. The Nassau there in the middle, that's what the Catawba were kind of referred to sometimes at the time, the large one in the middle. And you can see all of these lines representing those trade networks. But what you'll also notice on there is there's no like borders, right? They didn't conceive of nationhood as the way that we do today. But when white folks got here, they saw all these relationships, and then they drew a map that looks something like this. So this is a map depicting basically the same region at the same time period. But this one is, again, made by, honestly, by historians, right? Who were looking at these maps and writing this stuff out. And what I want to point out, we're right here in Charlotte, and you'll notice there's this massive trading route, number 10 there. It's called the Occaneechee Path, which is probably never what it was called, but it's the Occaneechee Path here. It goes right through Charlotte. And the important thing here is that Charlotte was at the center of a trading network that is at least 1,000 years old, right? Archaeologists have looked on this path and they have found evidence of trading routes. That means that they find goods from all the way up in New England, from all the way down in Mexico, along this trail right here in Charlotte, right? Indicating that the Catawba people, before any white folks were here, were trading in this area. The reason I tell all of you this is because now let's go to another map. If you look at I-85 and 40 and then 85 here, that curve, it's the same route, right? So you might know that a lot of older cities in the United States are formed on rivers, right? Because rivers, that's how people transported stuff, that's how people moved around. Charlotte's really unique. We're not on a river. What's up with that, right? It's this right here. There was a trading post at Trade and Tryon that was already here. White folks got here, saw that trading post, and decided, well, let's build our city there. Why would we build another city 5 miles to the west when we could build it right at that trading post? So again, right, history is accumulating. Even though we might not have a single piece of physical evidence left of that trading post that existed at Trade and Tryon, the very existence of that intersection, right, is proof of thousands, if not millions of years of history, right? Those Catawba people were on this trading route because this was probably an animal migration route, right? Before humans created it into a route. Before that, you know, it was, those animals were probably chasing other animals, right? Right, we understand how there's cycles here, and it all builds. So again, there's that map. So after the Catawba people kind of established these trading routes, white folks came to the area. We're talking like 1700s now, is really when a lot of people think about Charlotte's history beginning, with the settling of the country, right? These white folks, they come from Europe. A lot of the Presbyterians that came down to Charlotte, right? A few Baptists, but not quite as many back in the 1700s. There were Quakers, and there were lots of folks who were doing what they considered to be settling the country, right? This was a wilderness. This was untamed. This was a place where humans did not control the environment in a way that was sufficient for the white folks. And they decided, we want to control it differently. So over here, this is a diorama that we have at the museum. It's actually a miniature, that's what a diorama is. But this is trade and triumph in 1775, right? And so when we think about, again, the beginnings of Charlotte, I think what a lot of us think about is this time. The first history books of Charlotte are called the Nuances, and they're about the American Revolution period. They're about all these white, mostly Presbyterian folks who settled this area, built those log cabins or sometimes stone houses, and settled the country, right? But again, what I want to emphasize here is what we do as environmental historians is we don't accept this idea that a land can be unsettled and then settled, right? We don't accept this idea that there was no history until this time period, right? I hope that a lot of this sounds like familiar concepts to you, right? I hope that I'm not like blowing anyone's mind here, but I think that like it's important as a way of thinking, because historians did not think this way for a long time. Historians for a long time told stories about this stuff and not about these people, right? And so that's an important correction that we make as environmental historians. So if y'all are interested in sort of learning about this period of settlement in terms of the environment, I've got some book recommendations for you here. First one is one that honestly all of y'all should read, which is A New Voyage to Carolina. How many people by raise of hands are familiar with John Lawson? Right? That's sad, right? John Lawson is a guy who we should all be familiar with as wildlife students, right? John Lawson was basically the first British explorer to come through the Carolinas. This was in 1700. He came through the Carolinas, spent 3 months in the area writing a book that you see there. You can buy this on Amazon. It's pretty cheap now because, you know, it's in like the public domain. But he wrote a book about this area describing the plant life, the animal life, the native peoples. He collected samples that formed some of the original collections of the British Museum as well, right? Like botanical samples that are still in the British Museum today from the Carolinas, collected by this guy. His descriptions of the native people, surprisingly empathetic. Most white people in the 1700s in the Carolinas were not willing to extend any grace to native people. John Lawson loved the people here so much that he actually never returned to England. He stayed here, founded the town of New Bern, the oldest city in North Carolina, was founded by John Lawson. He actually interacted with the local native people so much, trusted them so much. One day he went to a religious ceremony and was brutally killed by a sorority in the area. And that is the demise of John Lawson, right? Amazing figure in this area. You need to look him up. Now, in terms of other things about settling the country, I need to mention this guy here, Changes in the Land. That's the title of my presentation. Changes in the Land is a book written by a guy named William Cronin. It's actually not about North Carolina, but he's the guy, and this is surprising, we're talking like 1980s right now. He's really the first historian to ever talk about colonialism as an environmental thing, right? Now we take this for granted. Native people managed the environment in one way, colonizers came and changed how everything looked, right? That was kind of not a thing that historians had really looked at in any significant way until just a few decades ago. And Changes in the Land, nowadays, like when I read it in grad school, it reads kind of like my presentation sounds right now. Duh, right? It's about, right? It's about native people who used to live by the ocean, fished a lot. Then, when colonizers came, they started diversifying what they ate. Native people in some areas didn't have a conception of private property. Colonizers came, forced the idea of private property onto the indigenous people who had a different sense of what the land was. Again, things that we take for granted now, but things that really, in terms of like actual rigorous history, are pretty new ideas. So it's pretty special to be part of that. Other things that you might want to read: Becoming Catawba. This is a new book. It's not a cheap book, but it's written by the only historian who is from the Catawba Nation, and it's called Becoming Catawba, and it's focused on the role of women during this process of settling the country. Right? A lot of our documents are men talking to men, but that's not because men were in control of the Catawba Nation. That's because the white men wouldn't talk to anybody besides other men. Right? And so she basically corrects the historical record. Right, talks about this process from the perspective of the Catawba. But again, right, I want to problematize that idea of settling the country, the idea of civilizing the country. This should be something that we're familiar with, but it starts here with the beginnings of Charlotte. Yeah. So the next thing I want to talk about, right, the folks settled here, they create trade and Tryon and Uptown, but Uptown isn't really where the hustle and bustle is happening in Charlotte. Charlotte is still a vastly rural area at the time, 1700s, 1800s. And Charlotte is, Charlotte becomes an area where slavery is everywhere, right? We're talking almost 40% of people in Mecklenburg County throughout the 1900s were enslaved Black folks. Again, historians have known about slavery since slavery happened. Historians have talked about slavery for a long time, but now historians have started talking about slavery from an environmental perspective, right? When we talk about mining, that's a picture of a tunnel in Reed Gold Mine, right? A lot of us might imagine the gold miners went out to Colorado and California. In those movies, they're always burly white guys with big beards, right? But when we talk about the first gold rush in the Americas, right here in Charlotte, the folks working those mines were right? So when we think about these processes, these extractive industries, right? When we think about humans manipulating the environment, it's not enough just to say, we started mining, because we is doing a lot of work there, right? There are folks who own these mines who are trafficking human beings and forcing them to extract, or at least try to extract gold from those mines. And so when we think about humans and our relationship to the environment, like capital H, capital E, in my mind, stuff like this makes it a little bit complicated. So some books that I'll recommend that you read. First is The New Map of Empire. This book is really cool because it just includes lots and lots of maps that you can look at. And for me, what's really important about that is just the idea of mapping of the Americas, right? We started with this map back here, but all of these maps come out of an imperial process, right? These maps are useful because that is how white people think about the land. That allows white people to more efficiently exploit the resources that are in the land. It allows white folks to conceptualize a space that has never existed in that way, right? And that's what these maps are doing. We can get into a little more of the theory. This one right here is called Black Geographies in the Politics of Place, but it's the same idea, right? When we think about humans and their relationship to the environment, we have to think more critically about what humans we're talking about. I'm going to keep emphasizing that point here, but I get really tired of people who just say humans were so bad, they're just messing up the environment, right? I don't like it, right? I think that it's some, right? Most humans are just trying to survive, right? We would not blame the enslaved people for extractive mining industries. That's a ridiculous proposition that people who are trafficked, put in an economic situation, forced to do that. The idea that they are responsible for all of the environmental fallout from mining, to me, is frankly ridiculous, right? And I hope that will apply that in the modern context as well. Folks who are just trying to get by, just trying to survive, just trying to do their job. Sure, they're driving their car to work every day, right? Emitting carbon into the air. But we have to remember that there are systems in place that make a lot of these choices, that force a lot of these choices onto people, right? Again, there's that historical context that always matters. None of this happens in a vacuum. So the last book here, again, this one is, I quoted this one earlier, Spectres of the Atlantic. Very, very theory-heavy book here. But the story that's in this book, I think, is worth telling. It's about a ship called the Zong. Anybody heard of this story? Sometimes people have. The Zong is a really famous story of a ship that came across from Europe on the Middle Passage. And they were, on that ship, were enslaved Africans being trafficked across the ocean. And there was also a bunch of fruit and produce and stuff like that from Africa, right? And as the boat is coming along on the journey, they hit a storm and they have to make a decision. We got to dump some stuff over. And you all can probably tell where this is going, right? Those enslaved people on that ship, they had an insurance policy on those enslaved people, and the owners of the ship knew that it would actually be more profitable for them to dump the enslaved people over the ocean, kill them, massacre them, than it would be to try to get them across the ocean and deal with whatever ramifications occurred once they got back, right? They knew that they would make more money by dumping the enslaved people over than even by dumping all the produce over, right? And so in other words, when we talk about, again, when we talk about commodification of the environment, how private property developed, how people just started to be able to buy everything, the environment became, we put a dollar sign on every single tree, right? Again, not all humans are doing that. There are structures put in place where people are literally put on the same line of an accounting ledger as produce, right? I deal with this every day in my job. Hezekiah Alexander, the guy who owned the home site where I work, right? The only reason we even know about the enslaved people is because he listed them right next to horseshoes and wheelbarrows and horses, right? So when we talk about commodification of the environment, we have to be careful about what type of people we are talking about. Creating capital. So when we get into the modern era, right, this is probably the part of Charlotte's history that maybe we're more familiar with. The fact that Charlotte rapidly becomes a textile hub, right? Cotton plantations are booming. All these textile mills are popping up, especially over in Gastonia, right? There's massive plantations of cotton, of indigo, of tobacco, of all of your cash crops, right, are going all around Charlotte. I'm preaching to the choir when I talk about sort of the impacts of monocrop agriculture. We're talking about disease, we're talking about nutrients being taken from the soil, all of that, right? But what we're also talking about is just like a completely different version of what Charlotte has ever been. So in the 1920s, Charlotte became the largest city in North Carolina, right? That was largely because of the textile industry. And through the 20s, 30s, 40s, Charlotte is just rapidly expanding. And for me, like in terms of the environmental history, kind of the pinnacle of that expansion is the creation of the dam that would create Lake Norman. So this is a newspaper article from the 1950s, and you can see, it's kind of hard to see, but basically they are saying we'll have fun on an inland sea, right? They're saying a recreational paradise. In other words, right, the framing of this is they don't care about the environment, right? As we probably know, under Lake Norman are multiple entire towns. We're talking cemeteries, right? We're talking ancient, 1,000-year-old archaeological sites, right? Some of the original Catawba towns in this area that Fernando de Soto found in the 1500s are now underneath the Lake Norman, right? So when we talk about human manipulation of the land, we're talking about stuff like this, right? Building modern landscapes is what I have it labeled. And the reason I have it labeled that is because of this book by Donald Forster. He kind of like thrown in as one of those like foundational, you're interested in environmental history, read his books, right? And what he's talking about the West, but he really emphasizes the idea of damming rivers, like massive dams, like that create Lake Norman, right? Especially, he's focused a lot out near Las Vegas and in Idaho and a lot of those huge dams over in the West. But it applies here, right? That this control of the water is a defining feature of this new era of modernity in the United States, right? That it's not just about needing more energy. It's not just about having more people, but it's about showing that you can control and manipulate the land in a way that benefits some and does not benefit others, right? We already talked about people who didn't have a choice. Hey, we're going to dam this river, get out, right? We're talking about, in the West, we're talking about the continuation of a genocide of Native people who are still living in the West in the 1900s, right? Rivers of empire, what he's talking about is how, interestingly, rivers through American history, again, have always been where we can kind of trace a lot of what has happened here in the United States, right? We talked already about how trade happens on rivers, how transportation happens on rivers, but in addition, colonialism happens through rivers as well, right? Again, pause here. I hope that most of this sounds pretty obvious to all of us. Again, I hope that I'm not blowing anybody's mind, but I hope what I'm getting at here is that there's an environmental angle to all of this. What we do as environmental historians is really interdisciplinary, right? We rely on y'all to provide a lot of the data, right? Y'all as biologists, as scientists, as wildlife stewards, pay really, really close attention to the natural world in a way that I don't, honestly, as a historian. But what I do is I pay attention to history, and I think that there are a lot of intersections here. So one example is this map right here, that it was made by the Catawba Lands Conservancy. And for me, this is like one of the most useful sort of historical tools that I've seen about Charlotte. It's Charlotte in 1976, and then a projection of Charlotte in 2030. And I know it's probably blurry to a lot of us in the back, but you get the point. On the left, there's lots of green. On the right, there's not, right? And that's something that as a historian, you can kind of say with a 10,000 foot view. You can say urbanization has caused us to cut down a lot of trees and we're losing our green cover and our canopy cover, and that's really bad, right? But when we have data like this made with experts using GIS, right? Data that's super granular that we can actually look through, that's when this stuff becomes like real research, right? That's when this stuff becomes rigorous academic stuff. So again, like that's where environmental historians are at. It's honestly, we're probably lagging behind y'all by about 2 decades in terms of the ideas that we're talking about. But I think what we're doing is adding a little bit of a historical angle. Other things to think about here, the book on the right there is called Nature's Metropolis. Again, by William Cronin. He's my, he's the guy. But Nature's Metropolis, what he argues in that book is that stuff like this, the damming of Lake Norman, he's talking about Chicago, the growth of Chicago as an industrial city. And what he says is that essentially the growth of those cities are inextricable from the creation of rural agricultural spaces. Essentially what he's arguing is that urban and rural are useless categories because Chicago could not grow into what it was without all of the farmland surrounding it and all of the cattle and all of the livestock that are the rest of Illinois and Iowa, where I'm from, right? Those two things do not exist without each other. And so when you think about something like Lake Norman, right, the city of Charlotte, as we think of it today, does not exist without the massive manipulation of these spaces that we might today consider rural. But again, these rural spaces are inextricable from the city. One does not exist without the other, right? And again, duh. But this is the first book where he's arguing this, right? This is like a 650-page book about Chicago's history. And it got a lot of criticism when it was written because there's like no people in this book. Historians for a long time wanted stories. They wanted the people who did the cool things. And in this book, he's talking about heads of cattle, railroad systems. He's looking at maps of Chicago neighborhoods. He's looking at flows of goods across systems. And yeah, there's basically no characters in the book. It's data, right? It's, in a lot of ways, it's environmental or spatial or geographical science more than it is history. And for me, that's just really special, right? Because I think that shows that you can bridge these gaps. Book here, The City and History. Just a reminder that when we say the word environment as environmental historians, most of us environmental historians would argue that everything is the environment. So I just put that book there, The City and History. Lewis Mumford in that book basically argues that cities are part of our environment. Again, that, that the idea that humans used to interact with wilderness and now we interact with cities, right? Basically, he's arguing against that, saying that the landscapes and structures of cities affect how culture works. Again, duh. So as we get closer to what we would now consider, the sort of modern era of Charlotte, I wanted to show you a map that I think most of us have probably seen before in some form. This is an example of how environmental manipulation doesn't just occur manipulating green stuff. It occurs with manipulating a lot of the gray stuff that exists inside of a city as well. So this map right here was made in the 1930s, and it is sort of exactly what it looks like. The red areas have been redlined. They're the areas that were designated by the Federal Housing Authority as I don't even know what word they use on this map specifically, but essentially as areas that are not worth investing in, right? These are areas where you couldn't get a mortgage. These are areas where Black folks live and poor folks live. And so all the green areas would have been the white neighborhoods in Charlotte. So what you notice here is that our nice little interstate is missing. So let's go to map number 2. And you'll see right there, I'll just kind of go a little back and forth clicking. Brooklyn neighborhood, Biddleville / Johnson C. Smith, West Charlotte area. Plowing through with an interstate, right? So I'll kind of go back and forth again. And so what I have as the title here is establishing healthy communities, because what we start to see during this era is that the folks in power start to use environmental language to justify some of this. So here's where I want to warn everybody in this room who cares and is passionate about wilderness to be careful about the implications of some of their work. Because in this case, liberals, progressives, people maybe like us in this room, a lot of them were thinking, or a lot of them were basically reading this data that said these areas are blighted. And this was a term, like an actual legal policy term, blight meaning unhealthy, not even worth living, unfit for human residence, right? And again, the justification was, we want to make it healthier for all of our Black population. We want them to have, maybe today the modern version is we want to create more green spaces in these neighborhoods, right? Again, good idea. People should have green spaces. But in this case, what it led to was bulldozing their neighborhoods, destroying their culture, kicking them out of their communities. Sometimes today, right, I think maybe the modern equivalent is gentrification. Building nice green spaces in parks in poor neighborhoods causes rents to rise. It causes people with more money to move in, kick out the poor people, right? We understand how these processes, people with good intentions, or maybe often bad intentions during this period as well, but people with sometimes good intentions can create policies like this, right? Based in environmental language, based in, we want Charlotte to be a city that's healthy for everyone, right? We want Charlotte to be a city that doesn't have blight, that has beautiful green spaces, that's easy to get around, right? All of these amazing ideals that in practice can reinforce a lot of this stuff. So again, this is where I just think like historical context is always, always, always important. That is why environmental history exists, is because the environmental movement kicked off in the 60s. We probably know some of this history. Earth Day started right in 1970 and all of this. And historians responded to that because historians were hearing a lot of language that mirrored this type of stuff. Historians were hearing a lot of, oh, humans are just ruining our environment. Well, which humans? Whose environment? Right? These are questions that are really, really important, that we are sort of asking you all to think a little bit more deeply about. So let's talk about the modern era. How many of us have heard the term Anthropocene? Okay, cool, most of us. So the idea behind the Anthropocene is that we are in a new geological era where nothing can escape the human reach, right? And I think you see where I'm going with this. If you look over on the right, you'll see just examples of how that Anthropocene concept is very pervasive. All of these articles are from like the last year. Some of them are actually from the last few weeks. On the top, in a first, microplastics are found in fresh Antarctic snow, right? Even places where humans have never permanently inhabited, our impact is there. This is the second one. The US military emits more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than some entire countries. Right? Again, we're talking about a scale that is very, very hard to comprehend in terms of environmental change. The third one, an underestimated burden of polyfluoroalkyl substances in global surface waters, also known as PFAS. You might have heard of these. They tested 45,000 water samples from around the world, and over half of them had PFAS. Right? This stuff is everywhere. Last one there, this article is from today. I actually saw it on Twitter, coincidentally, as I was making this presentation. Consumer Reports urges USDA to remove Lunchables from the National School Lunch Program. They found high levels of lead and cadmium in Lunchables. They found PFAS and forever chemicals in Lunchables, right? Again, everywhere. So that is why people have started to name this new era the Anthropocene. Again, I ask you all to think a little bit more deeper about what the Anthropocene means for us. Because anthro, meaning humans, is it really all of us? Right? When you look at the US military emitting more carbon dioxide than entire countries, is it really all humans? Or is it certain segments of certain industries, right? Is it certain groups of people, right? When we look here, this is a picture of the Duke coal ash spill, right? I didn't do that, right? You get what I'm saying? Like, this is part of an industry that operates on a scale that we cannot comprehend, right? And like, I mean, maybe you've seen like drone footage of oil fields, right? And when you look at those, I mean, for me at least, it hits me that this stuff, there is a history here, there's a lead up here that most humans are completely unaware of, right? And so what scholars have now sort of asked people to think about is, for example, here's a book, Anthropocene or Capitalocene, which nobody's calling it Capitalocene, that's a terrible term, but you get the point from the title, right? Maybe we should be more specific. Maybe it's about people that control a lot of capital, right? Some people have said we should call it the plantation scene, which I think is also interesting because that names modern industrial agriculture as a key driver of this, right? It indicates that it was white settlers establishing plantations with enslaved people on them that was the origin of all of this, right? None of this would exist without the institution of slavery. Plantations and monocrop agriculture. We know about the greenhouse gas emissions that are a result of that. We know about all of that stuff I mentioned earlier about the problems with monocrop agriculture, oil fields, all of that, right? Anthropocene, I don't think, really gets at where we are at right now. I think it allows people, again, to say, humans, we just suck. Humans, our plastics are everywhere, right? And for me, I think that can take us as the environmental movement. I hope I can say maybe we're all part of that, right? I think that can take us as an environmental movement to a very cynical place, right? And I think that knowing your history, even if it's the dark history, right, can help avoid some of that cynicism. It helps you recognize that there's always context here. There's always just people making decisions, and a lot of times people in power making really bad decisions. Just here's some more on that, right? Just a basic graph, something you've probably already seen about, this is cumulative historic emissions, right? So you might see lots of articles today about how India and China are emitting so much more than the United States, or how is Africa going to develop without greenhouse gas emissions, right? Yeah. And then when you look at this, for me, those discussions become quite ridiculous, right? The USA and the European Union set the tone, right? And nobody else has even come close. China has, what, 1 billion plus people, and they're still not even close to the cumulative emissions that the US has put into our atmosphere, right? So again, that historic context is key. When you look at it in a vacuum and you just say, who are our biggest emitters today, right? That lets off a lot of people off the hook, right? That lets off all of these stories that we've gone through about Charlotte. You're basically letting all of these people off the hook and blaming some other country for the problems, right? When in reality, a lot of this originates right here with the people that we interact with every single day. On the right, this is sort of related, sort of unrelated, but this is June 10th, 1873 in the Charlotte Democrat. This is the first mention of the phrase climate change that I can find in Charlotte history, 1873. And if you read his argument, he's not really making an argument on the like it's not that interesting really, but what he indicates is basically his argument is humans have always changed the environment. Like, don't worry about it. And this is 1873. They don't have the same kind of data that we do today. He's making some weird argument about some Greek historian who said a river froze a long time ago. Like, right? This is not like a scientific article. This is a dude writing an opinion piece in a newspaper article 150 years ago. But what I think is interesting is that humans have been thinking about their impact on a global scale for a long time. People have understood that humans have this kind of impact for a long time. This isn't something that nobody ever thought about until a few decades ago. Oh no, climate change, right? This is something that is baked into how humans understand the environment. Charlotte. I'll also say the Charlotte Democrat was a relic of a Confederate newspaper at the time. So, you know, Confederate supporters, climate change deniers. So we'll end it here. These are a lot of these binaries that I've been talking about today, right? Natural and artificial, right? Wild and settled, rural and urban, barbaric and civilized, past and present, pristine and manipulated, environment and human. What we do as environmental historians is we try to kind of problematize these binaries, right? We think that as historians, what we do in any subject that we are in is we tell people that it's much more complicated than we think, right? And so I hope that what I talked about today maybe challenges us to think a little bit deeper about some of these words that we're using. I'm not saying the Charlotte Wildlife Stewards need to change their name because wilderness is a problematic concept, right? Like, that's not what I'm trying to argue, right? But what I am arguing is that when you think about yourself as a steward of wildlife, like, I hope that you don't think that, you know, I hope that you think a little bit deeper about what type of wildlife. Maybe that's what I'm coming at, right? When you think about creating pristine natural environments, right? I hope that you recognize that arguably that doesn't exist, right? Pristine nature, in my opinion, isn't real. That doesn't mean that we turn into cynical people and we accept that we'll never have wilderness ever again. In my mind, it's the opposite, right? It's that we recognize that wilderness never existed, and that the idea of wilderness was a tool of settler colonial people who came to the United States and decided that they needed to tame that thing that they called wilderness. Because that thing that they called wilderness was inhabited by people who had been living here literally forever, right? And so, you know, I don't really know how to wrap this up in a way that feels sort of a nice little bow. But I hope that maybe we can just have a conversation about this. Like, I, as an environmental historian, try to put this stuff into practice, right? Like, I was a park ranger. For me, what that meant as a park ranger was a lot of folks who interpret the natural world at Rocky Mountain National Park talk about, look at this wilderness area. It's a federally designated wilderness area that humans are not allowed to touch. Look at all these trees with no humans are allowed to do any, we're not even allowed to use any machines, any technology in this park, right? And then you look into the history more deeply and realize that to establish that pristine wilderness, they had to kick people out of the area, right? Like, there's a very intense irony about that, right? That to create wilderness, you had to get rid of people. Mind-blowing, right? I want you to think about the fact that humans invented nature, right? Kind of, maybe that's the mind-blowing quote of the day, but nature doesn't exist without humans, right? The natural doesn't exist without the artificial, right? Somebody had to decide that's not me, right? And when we do that, we start to create a lot of problems. We start to say, well, the native people, they're more over here, and then we're over there, and then some people fall in the middle, right? And we get into a lot of problems with urban renewal. We get into problems with colonialism and taking people's land for their own good. So with that, I think I'll go back to the beginning. And I'll just leave you. Maybe we'll end on this right here, which is that wilderness is not the last place where civilization has not fully infected the earth, right? This stuff has already occurred. There's already people who have done all of this before you. There's a reason why all of this exists. And we need to respect that. We need to respect the people who were here before us. We need to respect the land itself. So I'll leave it there. Not a nice little neat bow. But I hope that we took something out of this. I hope that I gave you a little bit of a glance into like what I do, how I think about the world. And yeah, thank you. So what questions do you have? Like, I'm happy to talk more like actual history too. Yeah.
I may have trouble formulating this question, but more than one occasion to your presentation, seem to be making the point that I'm not responsible, it's just people
Right.
in power. So could you just slow down a bit and explain that again? You mentioned it in particular with regard to the dam river spill.
Yep.
And the Anthropocene a little bit. So
Yeah.
why was that an important distinction to you? To say that a few people are responsible, but not everyone.
Because for me, why that's important is because when we blame humanity, in a way, in my mind, this is just sort of my opinion, it feels like a bit of a cop-out, right? It makes you feel like, oh, this is just an inevitable relationship between humans and the environment. That humans inevitably exploit the environment. All of history has led to this moment where everything is affected by humans. And for me, I think that ignores that actually most of the major environmental catastrophes of our time are the reason that they exist is because of structures that were created by certain people who are in power. That's not to say that we're not responsible. Again, my point is not, it doesn't matter if you roll coal and buy a huge truck because like, it's not your fault, right? Like, I guess, I hope that it didn't come off that way, but I hope what I am trying to emphasize here is that like, I wasn't the one that destroyed an entire town with an active public transportation system and built a highway, right? Like I wasn't the one that made it so that you have to drive a car around Charlotte.
So what? So what's your point?
So what's the point? The point is that as an environmental movement, we can target specific people, we can target specific structures, that there are certain people who we can hold accountable for making these decisions. Because I think when the environmental movement, like, you know, I mean, we've heard these critiques before, right? When the environmental movement says, turn off your lights when you leave the house, that is putting the burden on individual people to solve a problem that is much, much bigger than any individual could ever be a part of. So I hope that makes sense. Again, the idea is not let people off the hook. The idea is not don't tell people how they can individually contribute to solutions to this problem. I think that the point is to not shame people for doing things that you consider wrong or bad for the environment. The point is that a lot of people are making decisions for reasons that are so far out of their control that I think we just need to be more empathetic to a lot of these communities, right? We need to be more empathetic to communities in poverty who, you know, can't afford to eat the kind of healthy meals that you might be able to eat if you have money, or can't afford to live in an area with good public transportation and have to drive to work, right? To say that we should all stop driving is to ignore that a lot of people can't. So I hope that gets at your question, right?
So you seem to think that there are institutions that are putting the blame on the general population for the environmental situation we're in?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, for example, I mean, you know, this is maybe a hot take, but like, I think recycling programs are a really good example of that. Like the idea that like, I can buy some granola bars and then put my cardboard in a bin and like, I'm now an environmentalist. Like for me, I think, again, that's just ignoring where a lot of these problems are coming from. Like, I don't really have a choice to like, you know, like I bought this USB drive and like, I didn't choose to like, that they package that in plastic, right? That's kind of what I'm getting at. But basically it's just take a structural view of how this stuff works, not an individualist one.
It seems to me like that the data that accompanies some of that structural view too, like the fact you had the article about the military getting more emissions than all of Denmark or something. I didn't know that before I walked in here. But as a voter, I can say, hey, how are we holding the military accountable for their sustainability?
Right.
But I would ask those kinds of questions of my politicians if I didn't know that.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, that's exactly, I think the point is that when we start to identify all of the historical reasons why this stuff exists, in a lot of it, for me, like there is one way to think about it that, yeah, becomes a little bit cynical. It becomes like, oh my God, all of this, how do we ever break out of it? But at the same time, I think when you can identify specific things, like we know who is doing the emitting, right? We know that a lot of, right, like we know who is being irresponsible with our energy production, like, and it's not me. So that's right. Yeah.
So we're in the Anthropocene era right now,
right?
And what would be, name the next era that you would like to see? Is it a colonialism or
Right.
What would be the next era that perhaps people sitting here tonight would like to move towards?
I mean, I don't know. Something to remember is that eras on a geological scale, we're talking millions of years. So we're talking about an era that will not end until humans end. Right? Like, I mean, that's what Anthropocene means, right? It means that humans have created a world where nothing's out of their reach, and that will be true until humans aren't here. So, I mean, I think for us, again, there's a sort of dark reading of that, which is we're screwed, right? But there's also a sort of like liberatory version of that, which is humans manipulating their environment is an inevitable part of history that has occurred since humans have been on this planet. And we should embrace that. Humans have always manipulated our environment. Humans have always created environments, plural. And we can create a new environment that is better, that's healthier, more equitable, etc. Right? So I think, in a way, I think maybe the solution is to like embrace the Anthropocene. Maybe that's kind of like a deep, like a faux deep thought, but that's kind of where I come from, right? It's like embrace this stuff. Embrace again, like that we know who is doing a lot of this and that we can change that. So yeah, like I don't know what comes next. But I know that like if an environmental movement is going to be successful, it can't keep seeking out the creation of a wilderness that never existed, right? And that's why I started with an article called "The Trouble with Wilderness," is because we get in trouble when we think, what is beyond human manipulation? There is nothing. We are humans. We manipulate our environments. That is part of what life is. And so we need to embrace a version of that that is good for everybody. That's kind of how I think about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that Anthropocene could mean something good.
Right. Right.
It could mean that we learn how to manage our environment better than we currently are.
Right.
And then going back to the previous question too, I think one of the most insidious things that happen where we as individuals who are consumers, who are citizens, are being blamed, or inadvertently almost, when say certain car companies or airlines ask you to pay extra cash so you can offset your carbon footprint.
Right.
That I would say is the worst.
Right. Exactly. When it becomes an individual thing, it allows people to do. It allows people to feel like they are part of a solution when they are actually not, right? It allows people to feel like, oh, I paid my $5, so like this flight, so now flights are good for the environment because some people paid $2, right? And when reality is like it's sort of self. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, I like what you said. There's a good version of the Anthropocene, right? Yeah.
Just really quickly, greenwashing is what you're describing. It's really a perfect term, but maybe you didn't quite know that was there.
Yeah.
And then my understanding of the Anthropocene is that it depends on how you define it. So a lot of people will define it as the beginning of the Neolithic Revolution, which is when farming started, and you can also define it as when the Industrial Revolution started. You can also define it as when the tech boom started, 50 years ago. You can also define it like right now. So it depends on how you're looking at it and through what lens you want to end it on. So if you started with farming, then okay, when we stop farming again and go back to hunter-gatherer, society, that could be the end of the Anthropocene. But I agree. I think it's just when people are no longer here, no longer manipulating the environment, that would be it. That is
Exactly. Yeah. What's up?
As far as the Dan Rivers go, Duke Energy was responsible for that.
Right.
I just want to let everybody know that tomorrow night at 7 o'clock, there's a hearing. The North Carolina Utilities Commission going to have a hearing on Duke Energy's proposed changes to the North Carolina carbon plan.
Nice.
And prior to that, at 5 o'clock, There's gonna be the press conference in Raleigh outside the courthouse. That's 842 East 4th Street.
That's tomorrow.
Yeah, that'd be an example where maybe we could shift the blame from us.
Exactly.
Where it really belongs.
Exactly. Yeah. And if you're interested in discussing the carbon plan a little more, talk to her. She works at Clean Air Agency. Yeah. So if you are interested in holding Duke Energy accountable for a lot of this stuff that they have done in North Carolina, yeah, exactly. There are already organizations in this area that are doing that. Yeah.
I'm trying to kind of think about all these things that you said, and thinking about being in the Anthropocene and how no matter what we do, we've always been manipulating our environment. One of the thoughts that I've had is that for so many years, as we've been colonized, we've moved in a direction that has not seemed to be good for the natural environment. And I've had that concept of wilderness or the national parks or whatever, and then there's that whole movement of the homegrown national park that Dr. Talamy advocates of. People just create, we can create that in our own yards. We don't have to go off to some park to experience nature. Nature exists in our yard. But I think one of my motivations to be involved with Charlotte Wildlife Stewards, North Carolina Wildlife Federation, is that there's been a recognition that, oh, maybe we've wrecked some things. And there's a term called restorative agriculture and restorative landscaping, and let's try to get it back to where it was. And I think that's a thought that comes from, we've had a lot of introduced plant material, and we're getting introduced insects and other animals and whatever, and they're here, they're going to stay, but instead of continuing with that, let's get back to, okay, what was here before colonization? We can't say what was here before there were humans here, because as you said, there were always been humans here. And a lot of those humans used those native plants. That was part of, they ate them, they were part of their medicine, they were part of their culture. Now I'm just starting to ramble, but I think part of what the Native Plant Society, what we do, part of what we say with plant natives, whatever, is try to restore some of that.
Right.
We're still going to be here.
Right.
And I think part of that is like, at some point maybe humans aren't going to be here anymore, and that is it going to be some kind of Anthropocene apocalypse?
Yeah.
We don't want that, And I sort of hear, like, oh, that's sort of where we're moving. We've destroyed so much of it. Yeah. I'm not exactly sure what my point is, but I think going forward, we can be manipulators of our environment in a healthier way. Yes. And does that make sense?
Yeah, it's something I picked up on there is like the idea of restoration. Like there's I don't know, maybe this analogy works, maybe it won't, but I'll just talk it out. So like in history, we have like historic preservation or restoration, right? Like we just moved a building to our museum campus. We are currently restoring it to what it would have looked like, right? And again, the idea is not we shouldn't do that. Right. I hope that you didn't take that from this presentation. Like, I feel like I am part of this movement. Like I am helping to lead invasive species removals and native plant plantings at the museum, right? Like these are things that I know are important. But when we think about the idea of restoration and historic preservation, we get into a lot of like really weird places. For example, the school that we just moved to our museum campus, it was a school for a few decades. Then it was a family home for a few decades. Then it was an auto body shop. So when you say restore this building, restore to what? Because technically the longest time it was anything, it was an auto body shop. Right? And so restore, and then we have a term called the period of significance. So that is something like any historic building that's designated officially a historic building has a period of significance. The reason, the significant history, right? The rest of it, but like the time it was a school. That's the part that matters, right? And for the Salome school, like it's called a school, it's very obvious. But when you get into other sort of restoration concepts, you get into a lot of iffy stuff where to restore to one thing, it requires that you cover up a lot of it. So maybe the analogy to restoration ecology, for example, is that, you know, it's not to not do it, but it's just to recognize that we are never going to achieve creating a landscape that was here with the native people, right? That should never be the goal. The goal should never be pristine, untouched wilderness. The goal should be a space that works for everybody, that is healthy, where people can thrive, right? Like those should be the values, right? Not these sort of nebulous, undefinable concepts of wilderness that never changes. So maybe that is kind of what you're saying there, but like, you know, I think that, again, a lot of this is stuff that we probably already sort of feel when we do this work. Like, you know, I don't think I'm blowing anybody's minds with that comment, but I think that, yeah, like restoration as a concept for me is just a little bit weird. I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
I get that. And
yeah.
The other thing is I see there's a lot of tension between how things were and how things are, and it just hit my mind. Like my husband has wanted to, you know, and he's explored woodworking with hand tools, you know, like, you know, with nothing that's a machine.
Right.
At the same time, he just got a new iPhone, you know, so there's a tension between, you know, some, you know, like these skills that may or may not be getting lost, and then the new things that we have to make things easier.
Right.
You know, because it's obviously harder to do something with hand tools than it is a machine, but there's also some satisfaction in that.
Yeah. Yeah, like I think on that note, for me, something that I see in my work a lot is, yeah, there's like somebody has already figured out a way to do it. And even though we continue to think, oh, there's a better way, oh, we can, you know, I think an example maybe in the environmental movement is that we want to tear down all those old inefficient buildings and build LEED certified ones, right? And then when you stop and think for a sec, you're like, well, how many emissions are we using to construct an entirely new building? You know, what about all the emissions that were already emitted to produce that original building that we're now destroying, basically making all of those good for nothing, right? So yeah, so basically I think that as we move forward in this movement, I hope that we sort of respect that people who did stuff before us were doing it for a reason, like respecting tradition, respecting traditional modes of doing things like that, I think are super, super important, because it's a recognition that like there are other ways of engaging in this world that are not through all of this data.
And it's taken us time to get to this point.
Yeah.
And I think recognizing some of the environmental impacts that are negative, I think is going to take a long time, you know, to, I don't want to use the word rectify or fix, you know, right. move away from, oh, now we know this is like that. Now we know it's harmful, so we're not going to put that in our place.
Don't eat lunchables.
You know, or yeah, but you know, some of us may not see, you know, what this is going to end up with. You know, that we're recognizing some of the harm that's been done, and now trying to heal some of that.
Yeah, and so something that I didn't mention is that environmental history is very much based, as is a lot of history, frankly, in like Marxist theory, and not in terms of like economic sort of like political theory, but in terms like Marx was a historian, and he had this idea of like, first of all, it's materialism, right? Which is really important to environmental history, that history is not just ideas and people talking and culture, it's like actual stuff. And that's an important part. And then the second part is the idea of like thesis, antithesis, synthesis, like the dialectic part of Marx, which for me is just, it's a useful thing to think about when we think about the future. Like there's sort of thesis of colonialism. There's the antithesis of like the wilderness movement. That's like go all the way back the other way, indigenize everything, go back to the wilderness. And I think there's some synthesis that will be produced by our movements at some point that figures out how we talk about this stuff, how we organize around a vision that is not a colonial vision, but it's also not a vision of a pristine wilderness that doesn't exist. It's a vision that is a synthesis of those two things. And I don't know if that exists, but you know, I think environmental historians like think that they are it. So yeah. But
yeah, I think you said at the beginning that history is accumulative,
yeah,
and there's a calculus that's gotten us to where we are. And I think what I think a number of people think in this room is we need to change that calculus. We need to change the slope of the curve. And you know, and I think we're all kind of struggling with the vocabulary.
yeah,
We're uncomfortable yet with some of the vocabulary, whether it's political or whatever, but I think there's a feeling that a regression analysis from where we are,
yeah,
and where we've been doesn't look good for either humans or the environment.
right. Yeah, and I mean, like what you said, yeah, I hope that the presentation did not come off as like playing semantics. Like, you know, I'm not trying to be word police, like wilderness, it's just not a thing. You know, but what I do hope is that like on a more 10,000 foot view level, like as the wildlife stewards, you know, as you think about what the vision of your organization is, right? Like, and I think you already know this, that the vision is not turn Charlotte into a massive wilderness area, tear down every building in Uptown, right? It's to understand what our communities need, provide those services to them, create a world where everybody is healthy, where our wildlife can thrive, where we don't have to tear down people's neighborhoods and kick them out in the name of environmental health, right? Like that should be the vision. And I think honestly, like when were the Wildlife Stewards created, you know?
This started in 2013.
Okay, right, but so
Federation is what, 75?
1954.
right, and I mean, frankly, think about who was leading the environmental movement in the 1950s, right? It would have been a lot of people who were doing this stuff. It was a lot of the same people, right? We're leaders of this environmental wildlife movement. We need healthy, beautiful spaces for all people. So let's tear down people's neighborhoods and kick them out so that we can have healthy spaces, right? There was a certain person and a certain type of wilderness that those original people were thinking about, right? Like the 50s when this thing was created, I would be very not surprised if the National Wildlife Federation like didn't even allow Black people in their organization in 1950, whatever, right? And so like that's kind of where I'm coming from. Is like I hope that the environmental movement has sort of realized that they can't be the you know, you can't go full PETA, you know?
So I would think that as we vote, as we think about the city and the powers that be, we need an environmental historian to attend every meeting of powers that be. People think in such boxes. It's with such intense focus on their education, on their experience, but to make people think outside that box is a challenge.
Yeah. And it is a challenge. And I hope maybe like that's what you got out of this presentation. Like I hope maybe you are a little bit slightly more confused than you were. You know, like I got some stuff to think about kind of thing. Like this is not clearly, I hope you don't think that like I have, you know, like I'm talking this stuff through with you all as well, because these are just like, you know, this stuff to me is just like foundational reading of history of like what I did in grad school, and in my job every day I'm figuring out like what does all of this mean.